So let's talk about progression for a second. And I'm just going to go straight to an analogy. And the analogy is Callus versus Blister. So this is a progression of skin that I'm going to use as my analogy. Everybody probably has, if you've been in the gym, and you've been in the gym for very long, you probably have some calluses. This tough place in the skin, and every one of you, I'm pretty sure, has had new shoes or something similar, ill-fitting shoes, maybe some manual labor with a shovel that you haven't done in forever or ever, and you get blisters. Let's compare the two, because it's a great analogy. What's the difference between a callus and a blister? Literally, a blister is poor progression of force and time, and it creates an inflammation. It's too much for the current status or current state of that person's skin in that area. And I can't tell you if it was a whole bunch of force for a short period, if it was a moderate amount of force for a longer period, if it was a small amount of force. The point is, it was too much. What's the evidence? Poor tolerance. What's the problem with that? Well, that, once it's got an inflammation underneath it and bubbles up, that's going to come off. And the new skin underneath, where the blister was, is less tolerant than your original skin was. You actually backed up further than where you started. Let's look at a callus. Calluses are interesting to me. They don't require blisters to start. In fact, in most cases, what do I know? In a lot of cases, where you end up with calluses or places where the force was progressed differently. The skin didn't come off. In fact, you didn't know there was a callus forming there until it showed up to some degree. The progression of force and time was imperceivable. So consider this relative to exercise. What's the right stimulation to the body to change various parts? Well, I learned and believed that you had to tear the muscle down in order to build it back up. So far, in my experience, every time I tear a tissue, it creates scar tissue which doesn't act in any way like the original tissue. Just a consideration. And it's not the same thing. But let's consider bone. Now, I've heard people try to say the same thing about bone. If you break a bone, it grows back stronger. Bullshit. It's not stronger. And of greater importance with bone is we know exactly what makes bone stronger. And it is intermittent forces, not constant force, intermittent. It doesn't mean you have to go jump up and down, because every step you take is an intermittent force. Now, what's interesting is trying to figure out the amount of force that's appropriate for that. Some people, I remember the days when osteoporosis and dealing with that in the fitness industry was a big deal. And there were presenters saying, oh, if you've got a little lady with osteoporosis, have her load it directly, put a bar on her back. Yeah, I'm going to take her spinous process, I'm going to put a bar on the back. Are you retarded? I'm totally not going to do that. We don't really understand the application of force. We don't get amounts. We don't get progression. We don't even get the type of force required to stimulate different things. So let's go back and let's assume, when we're looking at tissue, let's assume there is some version of challenge that stimulates it. And how much is it? Is it progressive? Do I need to at some point cause some kind of microscopic minimal damage to the tissue? Is more always better? And might there be a progression that allows other things to occur that makes me better able to tolerate stress on the tissue? So one time I was talking with a doctor, and he said, oh yeah, we know definitively now from muscle biopsy and microscopic examination that, well, let's make it simple. Deep down inside of there, they looked pre-exercise and post-exercise at some folks, yank a little chunk of muscle out of them, put it under a microscope, and they noticed that after exercise, where the, some of you know this, some of you don't, I don't want to distract you and lose you if you don't, but the sliding filament theory, and deep down inside there microscopically, the way the actin and myosin and the cross-bridging relationship appear to produce contraction, over here, where the myofilaments were to attach to their end of the sarcomere, there were tears in that little tissue. So, the immediate assumption was exercise produces change by tearing these little microscopic elements. Okay? Let's rethink this for a second. Have you ever done an exercise that was too much and you couldn't walk for a week? That's officially an injury. And like the blister, you can't even get back to the stimulation in time. You got to wait 2 weeks, and if you get back too early, you just create more damage. I've known people who exercise until they were bruised. Now we, in our more is better world, we think that's so cool. I used to think that was pretty cool too. But it's not necessarily progress inducing. And we need to recognize that there was no part of the study that said which form or severity or degree of challenge was the one that produced the greatest response from the exercise. So the fact that that happened after exercise doesn't surprise me. The problem is assuming that that exercise and the way it was performed and its aggressiveness was what was ever going to lead to anything good. Because a person of low tolerance, based on regional tolerance or systemic tolerance, might actually go the wrong direction from that exercise. They might actually get worse at something. They might actually tear something bigger. So wouldn't we need to go study along with that? Well, here's 5 different increments of challenge: effort, intention, load, etc. And how far were they pushed? And which one of these seemed to produce the greatest actual change relative to the goal? And we'd have to control all the people. These have to be all the same people in a sense. They have to all be of the same state of exercise experience. Meaning if someone has already been working out for 10 years and I try to do this study on them, they're probably more tolerant in some ways, but have less outcome, have less adaptation to it, meaning they're already maybe maxed out in terms of their adaptation to exercise. But they're really tolerant of doing excessive things to themselves. So nothing bad happens, but they don't change either. So I've got to look at all these controls I'd have to deal with. The bottom line is that as much as we like to think we know these answers, we're not asking all the questions. So I would ask you to consider progression. It's entirely possible that you don't have to have a sledgehammer to drive a nail. It's entirely possible you do have to tap on that nail and maybe strike that nail somewhat forcefully as you get better at doing it, at the skill of it. But otherwise, bending the nail doesn't get the nail in there. And so this idea that more is always better is something we've really got to grow up and reconsider. There's an awful lot of people that have progressed to the state where they can do a lot of stuff to themselves, and it's appropriate for them, but it's not appropriate for everybody. And even that person is going to have days where it's not appropriate for them. That advanced, exceptional, highly tolerant person is going to have days where that level of stimulation is not ideal for them as well. Another and final analogy for you, and I to some degree like it better than the than the looks of the Callus and the Blister one. Let's talk suntan, sunburn. Now this actually works in really interesting ways because it's got degrees to it. And it's also a very skin-specific thing, because if you're a very, very pale person, your sun tolerance may be different than someone who's olive-skinned, et cetera, et cetera. So generalize here with me, will you? Is it possible that if you went out in the sun for 15 minutes 10 minutes. And please, no skin cancer letters, okay? Example, stay on topic here. Stay within context. I'm not saying go out in the sun. So think about this. You go out there, your first exposure for the year, and you go out there for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you come back in because you had to go do something. You couldn't stay out that long, or you had the self-discipline to actually come back in, and you don't see any response. There's no redness, there's no pink, there's no nothing. Question for you. Was there a stimulus to change? The answer is yes. If that's your first exposure, then there is a change going on inside of there. There is an improvement in tolerance. You don't have to see what really is a low level negative response in order to know that there was a change. Why? Because progression really is pretty much based upon your current accustomedness to something. What are you accustomed to now, whether it's an activity or sunlight? And if I've been accustomed to being out there none, 5 minutes is by definition more. 10 minutes is more. So let's say that they'll say that 15 minutes was a notch too much. And what happens? You get a little itty bitty hint of pink, and 4 to 8 hours later, by the time you wake up the next morning, it's gone. That might have been a really, for you, tolerable amount of overstimulation, to the point where you might even go, that was just right. Maybe so. I still say that it was within your tolerance, and that's the main point here. You could have got just enough that you were actually, well, the redness didn't even really set in until the next day. You ever been there? Well, then it starts to become a question of what's going to happen next. And it's varying degrees on this spectrum. That redness still might go away and you save your skin. It could, one notch too much exposure from that, peel. And you're starting over again, depending upon how many layers peeled off. That's really poor progression. Always starting over again, always creating some version of damage. That's not necessarily what's required by every tissue or every goal or every person in order to move forward based on what they're trying to move forward and who they are and where they are. Now we can go to the blister extreme again, was what happens if there's way too much sun. I remember one time when I was working at a hospital in wound care, and they brought a guy in who got drunk and was out at the speedboat races and fell asleep in the sun, and it was like 8 hours, and they brought him in. And I don't know where the blister stopped and the guy started. He was literally, it wasn't pretty. I'm sorry I'm laughing. I'm sure he's not even around anymore. He probably died from sun blisters at some point in time in his life. But the big thing was, it was like, oh my God, that was really poor progression. And he wasn't more blister proof after that. But the thing about cool progression is progressive. So think about this. That 10 or 15 minutes that didn't even make me red or pink means that next time I can go out, and I'm pretty sure I can do a little more than that. I don't know that I'd bump it up to an hour, but I bet that 10 or 15 can easily become 20, 25, 30. Right? And it's got to be the same sun, the same angle, the same clouds or none. There's got to be a lot of things that, that affect the light situation. But so you tolerate 30 minutes, and you might be able to double that from 15 to 30. You might be able to stay out for an hour next time. And if you're tolerating the hour and you're really building up your response or adaptation to this, and your skin's changing in its color, and you're getting that tan, holy smoke, you can probably go from an hour to 2.5, 3 hours without any adverse effects. And then from 2, 3 hours, you might be able to stay out all day. You might be able to stay out for 8 hours. Now, a lot of that depends upon turning over and all that stuff. You're standing here for 8 hours and it's all beaded down in this one place. It's going to be a big difference. So being out in the sun is also what's being exposed, all that kind of stuff, right? So, but I think it's a great example of progression, imperceivable progression, progression of progression. You don't have to keep adding 15-minute chunks. It can grow near exponentially at some point. And then at some point, it doesn't matter how long you stay out, you don't get any darker. At that point, it becomes about progression, becomes about maintenance. And that's a really interesting thing, because at some point in your life, I don't care who you are and what you do, if you're an endurance athlete, if you're a power athlete, whatever you are, there will be an end of progress. And no, right now where you're sitting, you're going, no way, man. No way, not me. Well, if that didn't happen to everybody, we would actually have bodybuilders with negative body fat. They would be translucent. You'd be able to see their intestines, okay? We would have bench pressers who are bench pressing, I don't know, 10, 12,000 pounds if they could continue progressing forever. So yes, I know you probably need the attitude of, well, I'm going to continue making progress, but continuing to make progress as your hormones change and your joints change and your tissues change, and they have little landmines in our tissues, meaning like areas of stress that were poorly tolerated, they're still harbored in there waiting to explode. Continued progress for someone who is matured in their sport or activity really typically means being smarter and not just killing yourself, but training smarter, more than just harder. So there's a really interesting thing there. At some point in time, the human body's guaranteed to start deteriorating, to going downhill. And exercise becomes more about not losing what you've acquired. And that, when your body hormonally and everything else is on a slope going down, and you're not taking drugs to help that, which has their own weird slope, that hormone replacement stuff. But basically, the longer you maintain, that is progress compared to the inevitable deterioration. That's a really cool thing to watch somebody who's still doing their activity in an appropriate way for their current state or status or accustomed level. And they're maintaining really, really well a lot of what they've achieved. And that's an incredibly cool thing. So this idea of progression to me is really, in so many ways, a constant state of investigation. Investigating tolerance, trying to take advantage of the increments we can progress, trying to be smart about it because more is not always better. And even if you can tolerate a lot, some days you can't. That's really, to me, what mastery of progression kind of becomes about.